Hello, my wonderful and beautiful friends. Welcome back to our channel. Today, we've got a wrongful firing at Walmart, a hilarious laptop troll, drama about sense, fake jobs, and mind-blowing mix-ups that will leave you speechless. I hope you enjoy these stories. Don't shake your head too hard. As always, you can send or link your own posts to this email right here. Let's jump right in. Don't forget to like and subscribe so we can enjoy more amazing stories together. Story 1, Hilarious, Fired from Walmart, Update. First up, we have an IDontWorkHereLady drama where OP got fired from a place they didn't even work at, and the update left the entire Reddit community stunned. OP was just an average person, shopping at Walmart, a place with endless cluttered aisles, the faint smell of popcorn from the snack bar, crackly loudspeakers calling employees, clanking shopping carts, and bright white lights reflecting off scuffed tile floors. OP wrote, "A power-tripping manager mistook me for a Walmart employee, fired me even though I didn't work there, and the update? She got arrested and lost her job." The star of the drama? Ms. P, the Walmart manager, whom OP described as about 45 years old, messy dyed brown hair, wearing a wrinkled dark blue uniform, voice like a blaring market loudspeaker, and an attitude like she owned the entire store. OP recalled, "Ms. P mistook me for an employee and kicked me out of the store. I trolled her a little, and the result was her own humiliation. All OP wanted was to buy some groceries and leave, but Ms. P's arrogance set the stage for a comedy of errors so satisfying that I was clapping while laughing." This is a story of mistaken identity, power trips, and a plot twist with consequences. Are you ready? Buckle up, because Ms. P is about to sink, and OP will have you grinning for the next 30 minutes. The store was packed with weekend shoppers when OP walked in. I was wearing a black t-shirt, jeans, and headphones, definitely not the Walmart blue uniform, browsing the home goods aisle, holding a pack of toilet paper, when Ms. P appeared. She stormed in from the customer service counter, walkie-talkie in hand, eyes scanning for someone to boss around, and then yelled over the intercom and all the store noise. "Hey, you! Why aren't you stocking shelves?" OP turned, pulled out their headphones. I don't work here." Ms. P squinted. "Don't argue. I see you standing there, get to work." OP wrote. I stood there, listening to her power trip, and thought, all right, lady. You want me to work? I'll give you a show. I wanted to scream, "Miss P, you got the wrong person, and you're yelling?" The trolling begins, and Miss P digs her own grave. OP shrugged and smiled. I don't work here. I'm a customer." Ms. P turned red, slammed her walkie-talkie onto the shelf, and roared. "Customer? What kind of customer just stands there? You're fired. Get out." OP smirked. "You're firing me, from where exactly?" "I don't work here." Ms. P yelled back. "I'm a manager. If I say you're fired, you're fired." OP crossed their arms. "Okay, call security. I'll wait." And she did. Ms. P stormed off, dragging a security guard, a 30-something guy in a black uniform, back with her. "Throw him out," she ordered, pointing dramatically at OP. OP wrote. She was screaming like a bad soap opera villain, and I was just standing there, amused as hell. A nearby shopper, a woman pushing a cart full of groceries, muttered, "Is this woman insane?" I was living for this moment. "Miss P, you just fired a customer. Let's see how this plays out." The security guard paused, looking at OP. "Do you work here?" OP chuckled. "Nope. Just trying to buy some stuff." Miss P shouted. "He's lying. He's lazy. Throw him out." OP decided to escalate. "Could we get a store manager over here?" Enter Mr. Q, the store's senior manager, a 40-something guy in a crisp white shirt. Mr. Question, what's going on? "Miss P, he won't work." "Fire him." "OP, I don't work here." Mr. Q turned to Ms. P. "Did you even check before trying to fire him?" Ms. P stammered. I thought. OP wrote. Ms. P froze, hands shaking. I was thinking, trying to backtrack now. Oh, it's too late, lady. I burst out laughing at this point. You just made her humiliate herself in front of her boss. Mr. Q reviewed the security footage and saw OP was just shopping. Mr. Q, turning back to Ms. P. You mistook a customer for an employee? Ms. P, sweating. But he looked like. Mr. Q, cutting her off. Like what? Apologize. Now. Ms. P, defeated. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. OP grinned. No problem, just, maybe look properly next time. Then came the twist. A few days later, OP updated Reddit. Ms. P was suspended, then arrested. Turns out, she had a history of harassment. Boom. I lost it at this part. I stood there watching her downfall, thinking, you tried to fire me? Well, now you're out of a job. Even the security guard laughed. She's done for. After everything, Walmart fired Ms. P, and Mr. Q texted OP. She's gone. Let me know if anything like this happens again. OP replied. Cool, I just wanted to buy toilet paper. Reddit exploded. This story went viral. Team OP. She deserved it. Who fires random people? OP handled it perfectly. If I were OP, I'd pretend to be an employee just to troll harder. Team Ms. P. Maybe she was just stressed. OP should have explained sooner. Next time, OP should wear a Walmart uniform and keep trolling. I was howling. Ms. P, you literally got yourself fired. Did she really mistake OP, or was she just flexing her fake authority? Was she paranoid that lazy workers were everywhere? Or was she trying to save face, and it backfired horribly? Whatever the reason, OP turned a simple misunderstanding into an absolute masterpiece of trolling. And guess what? A few months later, OP returned to Walmart and heard. Ms. P is banned from this store. OP winked at the security guard. You're welcome. OP didn't just win, OP made history. What do you think? Was OP a genius or was Ms. P just unlucky? Have you ever been mistaken for an employee? Let me know in the comments. Up next, a laptop buying troll fest. You don't want to miss it. Next, we have an IDontWorkHereLady drama where the original poster, OP, turned a misunderstanding into a legendary troll, leaving the entire electronics store stunned. OP, a regular customer, simply wanted to buy a laptop from a large tech store, the kind with gleaming shelves filled with computers, the faint scent of new plastic from product boxes lingering in the air, soft pop music blending with customers asking for prices, and bright white LED lights illuminating the spotless tile floor. OP writes, I just wanted to buy a laptop, but a lady mistook me for an employee and caused a scene, so I trolled her a little, and the result was absolutely hilarious. The main character of this drama is Mrs. C, an entitled customer whom OP describes as about 50 years old, with shiny blonde-dyed hair, wearing a glossy leather jacket, carrying an expensive handbag, a voice sharp as a knife, and an attitude as if she were the VIP of the store. OP recounts, Mrs. C latched onto me, demanding assistance, then screamed for a manager when I refused, so I handled it with a bit of trolling, and she ended up humiliating herself. OP just wanted to choose a laptop and leave, but Mrs. C's entitlement paved the way for a beautifully satisfying drama that had me both laughing and clapping. This is a story of mistaken identity, arrogance, and an unexpected troll. Are you ready? Brace yourselves, because Mrs. C is about to sink herself, and OP will keep you entertained for the next 40 minutes straight. The drama kicked off on a Friday afternoon when the tech store was moderately busy with a few scattered customers. OP recalls. I was wearing a gray hoodie, jeans, and headphones, not the red uniform employees wore, standing at the laptop section, holding a Lenovo box and checking its specs when Mrs. C appeared. She walked over from the accessories aisle, handbag in hand, eyes scanning the store like she was looking for a personal servant, and then she shouted over the music, "Hey, you there. Help me choose a laptop. OP turned, removed their headphones, and replied, sorry, I don't work here. I'm just buying one too. Mrs. C frowned. Don't lie. I see you holding that box, help me now. OP writes, I stood there, listening to her demand, and thought, all right, you want help? I'll give you help. At this point, I wanted to yell, Mrs. C, you're mistaking a customer, yet you're still demanding service. As the situation escalated, OP decided to troll just a little, leading Mrs. C to embarrass herself even further. I shrugged and smiled. All right, I don't work here, but if you need advice, here you go. I held up the Lenovo box and read aloud, this one has a Core i5 processor, 8GB RAM, 256GB SSD, good for light gaming. Mrs. C crossed her arms. No, I want a better one. Go get it for me. OP replied with a grin, sure. Just go grab it yourself, I'm a customer, too. Mrs. C's face turned red. What kind of lazy employee are you? Call the manager now. OP laughed. Go ahead, I'll wait. Then, Mrs. C stormed off to the service counter, dragging along a real employee, N, a 25-year-old guy in a red uniform. She pointed at OP and demanded, fire him. He refused to help me. OP writes, I stood there, watching her throw a tantrum, thinking, fire a customer? Let's see how this plays out. Meanwhile, another customer, a guy holding a pair of headphones, muttered, this lady is hilarious. And I was here cheering for OP, you just let her drown herself in her own stupidity. The drama reached new heights when the store manager, Q, stepped in. OP recounts. N looked at me and asked, do you work here? I smiled. Nope. Just buying a laptop. This lady mistook me for an employee. Mrs. C screeched, don't lie. I saw him holding a box. I countered, ma'am, customers hold boxes to check them out. You're holding a handbag, does that mean you work here? Just then, Q, the store manager, around 35, wearing a black dress shirt, arrived and asked, what's all this noise about? Mrs. C immediately pointed at OP, he's refusing to work. Fire him. OP crossed their arms. I'm a customer. She started yelling at me. Q turned to Mrs. C and calmly said, ma'am, he doesn't work here. But I can assist you. And that's when Mrs. C froze, her hands trembling, her face turning red. OP writes, she called for the manager, and now she had to deal with the consequences. I was laughing uncontrollably at this point. OP, you just made her shoot herself in the foot. As the realization hit, Mrs. C completely lost it. She screamed, I don't need you. I want him to help me. Q, unbothered, shrugged, he's a customer, ma'am. Please make your choice. Mrs. C then turned to OP, furious, you tricked me. I'm not buying anything anymore. I just smiled and said, I'm just buying a laptop. You were the one yelling at me. Then, in her final act of rage, Mrs. C slammed her handbag on the counter, knocking her wallet onto the floor, screamed, this store is terrible. And stormed out, accidentally knocking over a display of computer mice, sending boxes tumbling onto the floor. OP writes, I just stood there, watching the spectacle, thinking, you screamed at me, now deal with it. Meanwhile, N chuckled and asked, you done buying your laptop? I was absolutely thrilled at this point. OP, you just made her humiliate herself in front of the entire store. As the drama came to an end, OP relished the win. Mrs. C stormed out, leaving chaos behind. Manager Q told me, next time, just let us know if someone bothers you. I laughed, I just wanted to buy a laptop. Later, OP told a friend about the incident. Their response? Dude, you trolled her lightly but perfectly. From that day on, OP avoided being mistaken for an employee and made sure to grab their tech and leave quickly. And honestly, OP turned a simple mistake into a legendary troll. A few weeks later, OP returned to the store. N grinned and said, she came back, but this time, she quietly bought her stuff without yelling at anyone. I winked at him. That's thanks to me. And laughed. Dude, you made her behave. OP's troll wasn't just funny, it actually changed her behavior. What do you think? Was OP a genius or was Mrs. C just unlucky? Have you ever been mistaken for an employee like this? The main character of this drama is Mrs. T, a peculiar customer described by OP as around 60 years old, with messy silver hair tied unevenly, wearing a worn-out blue sweater, pushing a shopping cart full of items, speaking in a shrill voice like a fire alarm, and acting as if she's a scent detective. OP recounts, Mrs. T latched onto me because of the fried oil smell on my clothes, demanding my help. I pranked her, and she fell for it. OP just wanted to grab some groceries and go home, but Mrs. T's eccentricity set the stage for a hilarious drama that had me laughing and clapping. This is a story about scent, mistaken identity, and an unexpected troll. Are you ready? Buckle up, because Mrs. T is about to embarrass herself, and OP is going to leave you cheering for almost 40 minutes straight. The drama began on a Thursday evening when the grocery store was moderately busy with a few scattered customers. OP shares, I was wearing a brown hoodie and jeans, fresh off my shift at a fast food place. My clothes reeked of fried oil, strolling down the canned goods aisle, checking a can of beans when Mrs. T appeared. She pushed her cart from the next aisle, its wheels rattling, lifted her nose, sniffed around, and called out loudly, "Hey, you there. You smell like an employee, grab me a bottle of sauce." I turned to her, I don't work here, I just got off work." Mrs. T frowned, "Don't lie, fried oil smell means employee, now get to it." OP wrote, I stood there, hearing her logic and thinking, all right, lady, you want scent? I'll give you scent. At this point, I just wanted to yell, Mrs. T, what kind of sniff test is this? The drama escalated when OP played along and let Mrs. T set herself up. OP continues, I shrugged, smiled, all right, I don't work here, but if you say I smell like it, fine. I pretended to rummage through the shelf, grabbed the cheapest bottle of sauce, which had expired last month, and handed it to Mrs. T. Here you go, straight from the fried oil smelling employee. Mrs. T took it, nodding in approval, good. Now, get me some vegetables. I replied, oh no, you'll have to grab those yourself, I'm off the clock. Mrs. T shouted, what kind of lazy employee are you? Call your manager. OP wrote, she stood there yelling while I was trying not to laugh, thinking, oh, you want a sniff? Let's see where this goes. Another shopper, a guy pushing a cart, muttered, wow, this lady has a strong nose. Meanwhile, I was delighted, OP, you just made her flounder in the middle of the store. OP took the trolling to the next level when the actual employees got involved. OP continues, Mrs. T stormed over to customer service, dragging along Miss N, a real employee, around 30 years old, wearing a blue uniform, and pointed at me, he's not working. Fire him. Miss N looked at me, do you work here? I laughed, nope, I'm shopping. She thinks I do because I smell like fried oil. Mrs. T shrieked, fried oil means employee, I know it. I chimed in, yeah, I work at a fast food place, not here. You got the wrong scent. Then, Mr. Q, the manager, about 40 years old, wearing a white button-up, walked over and asked, what's all the commotion? Mrs. T pointed at me again, he's impersonating an employee. Get rid of him. I replied, I'm just a customer, she's the one sniffing me. OP wrote, Mrs. T froze, her hands trembling, and I thought, oh, you mis-sniffed? That's on you. I was laughing so hard, OP, you made Mrs. T shoot herself in the foot right in front of the manager. The situation got even worse for Mrs. T as the truth hit her. OP continues, Mr. Q asked, so you really think smell determines employment? Mrs. T nodded firmly, yes. Fried oil means employee. Mr. Q chuckled, well, he doesn't work here, so you're mistaken. Mrs. T yelled, no, I'm not. The smell is obvious. Miss N chimed in, ma'am, none of our employees smell like fried oil. You're on your own with your shopping. Mrs. T turned back to me, "You tricked me. I'm suing this store." I laughed. "Go ahead, I just came to buy beans." She pushed her cart towards the exit, accidentally knocked over the sauce bottle, and it shattered. Furious, she yelled, "This store sucks." OP wrote, I stood there, watching her performance, feeling victorious. "Oh, you rely on scent? Deal with it." Miss N chuckled, "She sure sniffed the wrong person." Meanwhile, I was grinning. "OP, you just made Mrs. T humiliate herself in front of the entire store." The grand finale was OP savoring the win as Mrs. T exited in shame. OP recounts, Mrs. T stormed off, leaving behind a mess, and Mr. Q told me, "Next time, steer clear of her." I laughed. "I just wanted to buy beans." The entire staff kept laughing about it for days. OP wrote, I went home and told my friend, who said, "Dude, you trolled her with scent, that's genius. Now I make sure to change clothes before grocery shopping." And I couldn't help but applaud. "OP, you turned a smell into a legendary prank. What do you think of this counterattack?" OP later added an update that had me in stitches. A few weeks later, OP returned to the store and saw Mrs. T shopping, but she wasn't sniffing anyone anymore. OP wrote, I winked at Miss N. "She's done sniffing, huh?" Miss N laughed. "She doesn't dare anymore after last time." OP thought, "Mrs. T, you lost to the smell." OP, not only did you win, but you also taught her a lesson. What do you think? Was OP brilliant, or was Mrs. T just pitiful? Have you ever been mistaken for someone based on smell? And that's the story of OP's hilarious "I don't work here lady" moment. A woman mistook someone for an employee because of fried oil, only to embarrass herself because OP was too clever. Absolutely legendary. Are you on OP's side or Mrs. T's? Have any mistaken identity dramas of your own? Drop a comment, I'm dying to hear. Next up, we have another wild firing demand. Don't go anywhere. Next, we have an "I don't work here lady" drama where the OP, original poster, was almost fired by an entitled customer from a job they didn't even have. The way OP handled it left the entire store speechless. OP was just an ordinary shopper visiting a home goods store. Imagine towering shelves stacked with pots and pans, the faint scent of new plastic wafting from product boxes, soft background music playing from wall speakers mixed with customers asking for prices, and bright white lights reflecting off polished wooden floors covered in footprints. OP writes, a lady mistook me for an employee and demanded I be fired when I didn't help her, so I trolled her a little, and the ending left her utterly humiliated. The main character of this drama is Mrs. K, an entitled customer whom OP describes as around 55 years old, with jet black dyed hair, a fluffy fur coat, an expensive phone in hand, a loud market-like voice, and an attitude like she owned the store. OP recounts, Mrs. K called for my help, then demanded I be fired when I refused. I decided to have some fun, and she completely fell for it. OP just wanted to shop and leave, but Mrs. K's arrogance paved the way for a delightfully satisfying showdown that had me laughing and applauding. This is a story of mistaken identity, power plays, and an unexpected troll move. Are you ready? Buckle up, because Mrs. K is about to embarrass herself, and OP will have you grinning for the next 40 minutes. It all started on a Wednesday afternoon when the home goods store was moderately busy with a few scattered customers. OP writes, I was wearing a blue t-shirt, jeans, and was browsing the kitchenware aisle, holding a frying pan to check its price when Mrs. K appeared. She had just come from the lighting section, phone in hand, eyes scanning for someone to boss around. She called out loudly, Hey, you! Why aren't you helping me pick out a lamp? I turned to her and said, I don't work here, I'm just shopping. Asterisk Mrs. K frowned. Don't lie. You're holding a frying pan, get to work. OP continues, I stood there, listening to her demands, and thought, all right, lady, you want to fire me? Let's make that happen. I just wanted to scream, Mrs. K, you've got the wrong person, and you're still yelling. As the situation escalated, OP decided to play along, leading Mrs. K straight into her own downfall. OP writes, I shrugged and smiled, ma'am, I don't work here, but since you keep insisting, Then I pretended to help. The lamps are over there, go pick one yourself, I'm busy holding this frying pan. Mrs. K's face turned red. What kind of lazy employee are you? Get me the manager. You're getting fired. I replied cheerfully, go ahead, I'll wait. Mrs. K stormed off to the service counter, dragging in a real employee, about 25 years old, wearing a blue uniform, back to confront OP. She jabbed a finger at me and yelled, she refuses to work, fire her immediately. OP writes, I stood there, amused, thinking, fire a customer? Let's see how this goes. Another customer, a middle-aged man browsing pots, muttered, this lady is hilarious. And I was just gleeful, OP, you've got Mrs. K floundering in her own mess. OP cranked up the drama when the actual manager, Q, stepped in. OP recounts, and turned to me, do you work here? I grinned, nope, just buying a pan. She's mistaken. Mrs. K shouted, don't lie. You're holding a pan. I shot back, ma'am, a customer holding a pan doesn't mean they work here. You're holding a phone, does that mean you work here? That's when Q, a man in his mid-30s, wearing a black button-up shirt, arrived, asking, what's all this commotion? Mrs. K pointed at OP and declared, she won't help me, fire her. OP crossed their arms and stated, I'm a customer. This lady is yelling at me. Q turned to Mrs. K and calmly said, ma'am, she's not an employee. Would you like me to assist you instead? OP writes, Mrs. K stood there, hands trembling, and I thought, you wanted the manager? Now deal with it. Meanwhile, I was dying of laughter inside. OP, you just made Mrs. K shoot herself in the foot in front of the manager. At this point, Mrs. K had humiliated herself, but she wasn't done yet. OP continues, Mrs. K screamed, I don't want your help. I want her fired. Q shrugged, she's a customer, I can't fire customers. Mrs. K turned back to me, you tricked me. I'll sue this store. I grinned, go ahead, ma'am, I'm just here to buy a pan. Enraged, she slammed her phone on the counter, accidentally dropping her wallet, and stormed out, knocking over a display of lamps on her way out. Asterisk. OP writes, I stood there, watching her flail, thinking, so much for firing me. Employee N chuckled, she really went all out. Are you done shopping? And I was just delighted, OP, you just made Mrs. K publicly humiliate herself in the middle of her own meltdown. As Mrs. K stormed out, OP basked in victory. She left behind a mess, and Q turned to me and said, next time, just call for help if someone harasses you. I laughed, I just wanted to buy a pan. Later, I told my friend, who said, that was a light but legendary troll. OP adds, now, whenever I go shopping, I avoid getting pulled into random drama, just grab my pan and leave. And I was just clapping, OP, you turned a simple misunderstanding into a masterpiece of trolling. Was this the perfect way to handle an entitled customer? After OP shared their story, Reddit exploded like fireworks on Black Friday. The first camp, Team OP, cheered, Mrs. K got exactly what she deserved. OP handled this like a pro. One commenter added, if I were OP, I'd have pretended to be the manager and taken it even further. The second camp, Team Mrs. K, argued, maybe she was just in a hurry. OP could have just explained properly. Someone joked, next time, OP should wear the store's uniform and troll even harder. I read all this, laughing my head off, but I'm firmly with OP, Mrs. K, if you make a mistake, own it, OP, you nailed this troll perfectly. Here's an extra detail that had me rolling. A few weeks later, OP went back to the store and N said, that lady came back, but this time, she didn't dare yell at anyone. OP winked and replied, that's because of me. N laughed, you made her behave. And I was thinking, Mrs. K, you lost to the entire store. OP, not only did you win, but you also taught her a lesson in humility. So, what do you think? Was OP a genius or was Mrs. K just pitiful? Have you ever been mistaken for an employee like this? Drop your stories, I'm dying to hear them. And with that, we wrap up this I Don't Work Here Lady drama. Up next, another hilarious mix-up, don't go anywhere. Finally, we come to an I Don't Work Here Lady drama that OP witnessed, where someone was mistaken for an employee, and their reaction left the entire supermarket in shock. OP was just an ordinary shopper at a large supermarket, the kind with wide aisles packed with products, the smell of freshly baked bread drifting from the food section, the crackling overhead announcements blending with the clattering of shopping carts, and bright white lights shining on glossy tiled floors marked with wheel tracks. OP writes, "I saw a lady yelling at a guy who didn't work there, and he trolled her lightly, leading to a hilarious cell phone that made my day." The drama's protagonist is Mrs. M, an arrogant customer, whom OP describes as around 50 years old, short dyed red hair, wearing a shiny blue coat, pushing a full shopping cart, a voice sharp as a knife, and an attitude like she secretly owns the place. The mistaken employee is Mr. T, another shopper, around 30 years old, wearing a blue polo shirt and jeans, looking totally normal but still getting dragged into this. OP continues. Mrs. M latched onto Mr. T, demanding help, and he decided to mess with her. I stood there enjoying every second. This is a story of mistaken identity, arrogance, and a masterful troll. Are you ready? Buckle up, because Mrs. M is about to sink, and Mr. T is going to make you laugh for the next 40 minutes. The drama unfolds on a crowded Saturday morning, with the supermarket packed with weekend shoppers. OP recalls. I was standing in the frozen food aisle, checking the label on a pizza box, when I saw Mrs. M push her cart from the next aisle and yell, "Hey, you there! Get me a bag of chicken." Mr. T, standing nearby with a carton of milk in his hand, turned around and replied, I don't work here. I'm just shopping." Mrs. M crossed her arms and insisted, "Don't lie. I see you standing here. Do your job." Mr. T shrugged. "I'm really not an employee." OP writes, I stood there, watching her yell, thinking, she's got the wrong guy, and he's definitely about to mess with her. At that moment, OP wanted to scream, "Lady, you got the wrong guy, and you're still demanding?" The situation escalated as Mr. T decided to troll her lightly, leading to her self-destruction. OP describes. Mr. T grinned and said, "Well, I don't work here, but if you want, I can get it for you." Then, he walked over to the frozen section, grabbed the smallest, cheapest, slightly torn bag of chicken, and handed it to her, saying, "Here you go, courtesy of your temporary employee." Mrs. M took it, frowned, and snapped. "Why is this so small? Get me a bigger one." Mr. T replied with a straight face. "Oh, my shift just ended. You'll have to get it yourself." Mrs. M exploded. "What kind of lazy employee are you? Call your manager." OP writes. I was dying of laughter watching her scream. A nearby customer muttered, "This lady is hilarious." Meanwhile, I was thinking, Mr. T just left her stranded in her own mess. The drama intensified as Mrs. M dragged an actual employee into the mess, and the troll reached new heights. OP continues. Mrs. M stormed off to the service counter and returned with Mr. N, an actual employee, about 25 years old, wearing a real blue uniform. She pointed at Mr. T and shouted, "He's not doing his job, fire him." Mr. N turned to Mr. T and asked, "Do you work here?" Mr. T, barely holding in his laughter, replied, "Nope, I'm just here to buy some milk." She got the wrong guy. Mrs. M screeched, "Don't lie. I saw you holding milk." Mr. T smoothly replied, "Yeah, because I'm a customer." "You're pushing a cart, does that mean you work here?" Then, Mr. Q, the manager, around 40 years old, dressed in a white dress shirt, stepped in and asked, "What's all the noise about?" Mrs. M immediately pointed at Mr. T and demanded, "Fire him. He refuses to help customers." Mr. T smirked and replied, "I'm a customer, and she won't stop yelling at me." OP writes. Mrs. M stood frozen, her hands shaking, while I thought, she messed up, now she has to deal with it. Meanwhile, I was laughing so hard, Mr. T just made her shoot herself in the foot in front of the manager. The moment of truth arrived, and Mrs. M humiliated herself beyond recovery. OP describes. Mr. Q asked, "Ma'am, are you saying he really works here?" Mrs. M nodded aggressively. "Yes. I saw him standing here." Mr. Q smirked. "He's a customer, ma'am. You made a mistake." Mrs. M shouted. "I did not make a mistake. He must help me." Mr. N, the real employee, tried to intervene. "Ma'am, I can help you, he doesn't work here." Mrs. M turned to Mr. T, furious. "You tricked me. I'm not buying anything." Mr. T shrugged. "I was just shopping, lady. You yelled at me for no reason." She shoved her cart away angrily, knocked the bag of chicken onto the floor, screamed, "This supermarket is terrible," and stormed out the door. OP writes. I stood there, watching her throw a tantrum, thinking, she messed with the wrong guy and paid for it. Mr. N chuckled, that lady was out of control. Meanwhile, I was cheering internally, Mr. T just made her embarrass herself in front of the whole supermarket. The drama finally ended as Mrs. M disappeared, and Mr. T basked in his triumph. OP concludes. After she left, Mr. Q turned to Mr. T and said, "Let us know next time if someone harasses you." Mr. T laughed, "I was just trying to buy milk." OP chimed in. I walked up to Mr. T and said, "Dude, that was legendary." He grinned, she picked the wrong guy to yell at. Later, OP told the story to a friend, who said, "That was a master troll, subtle but brilliant." Now, OP always keeps an eye out at the supermarket to see if anyone else gets mistakenly yelled at. Was Mr. T a genius, or was Mrs. M just unlucky? OP presents a theory. Maybe Mrs. M wasn't just mistaken, maybe she was trying to act powerful. She might have thought, I'm the customer, so everyone must help me. But she never expected Mr. T to fight back and have the whole store turn against her. Regardless, Mr. T didn't just escape the misunderstanding, he turned her arrogance into an unforgettable comedy show. What do you think? Was Mr. T brilliant, or was Mrs. M just pitiful? Have you ever witnessed a mix-up like this? Let me know in the comments, I'm curious. And that wraps up today's 5 stories, thanks for reading, and see you next time. If you missed the last episode on the channel, it was all about malicious compliance, where bad bosses got what they deserved. Check it out if you haven't seen it, and I'll see you in the next episode. We love you all.